Welcome, everybody. I'm Jack Naglieri and happy to be with you today, even if only in a video. I'm going to move through these images and talk about the basis of the work that I've been doing with Kim and Dina for many years. And you see that on this first image is I have my email. And I encourage you to be in touch with me as needed. So let's get started. First of all, I like to start with the big picture. And for me, especially as a school psychologist, I often think about how important the assessments, the identification procedures that we use are to students. We will change the course of a person's life based upon the information that we get and the decisions that we make. And oftentimes, the ability tests that we use will influence whether or not the student is identified. And interestingly, the three most widely used tests of ability in the gifted field really vary in terms of their fairness. And I'm going to explain that as we go through today. I love this quote from Einstein: what is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right. This is so appropriate because actually today, I'll be talking to you about things that you're familiar with and you've thought about for many years, but I'll be encouraging you to think about them a little bit differently. And especially as it relates to equitable or fair assessment, because it so much depends on some understanding of the nuance between test bias and test equity. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you kind of strip away all the scientific talk and you just think about it, what we really want when we want to measure intelligence is to be able to measure how well a student thinks to solve problems in a way that's not confounded by what that student knows. So this thinking about thinking, this idea that thinking is what intelligence is about, knowing is all about what a person has had the opportunity to acquire over time and through advantages. I first began to get interested in this topic when I started working as a school psychologist in 1975, a couple of years ago. I noticed that when I gave the whisk, I asked questions like vocabulary, arithmetic, word analogies, general information, and I saw those same kinds of questions on the achievement test that I was giving. And I remember thinking, that doesn't really make sense, but I did what I was taught to do. After a few years of working as a school psychologist in New York, I went to the University of Georgia to work on my PhD, and that's when I met Alan Kaufman, and Alan Kaufman was saying, well, maybe the verbal side of the whisk is really achievement. I really got a firsthand view of this problem when working at Northern Arizona University as professor. We did some work in the local schools, in this case, the local being Havasupai School, which is in a tributary of the Grand Canyon. Only 3 ways to get there. You can walk 8 miles through the desert, which we did. You could take a helicopter or a mule. When I was there, tested a young lady and got very interesting scores on the so-called nonverbal portion of the whisk. And remember, this is whisk R because this was 1981. On the nonverbal side, she had a very average score of 95, but on the verbal side, she had a very low score, a score that we would think of as, intellectually disabled today. But I wrote, the score cannot be considered an estimate of intelligence because she speaks mostly Supai and Little English. My colleagues at the university were not pleased with me because they believed that the nonverbal tests represented right brains and the verbal side was all about left brains. And I said, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard because the student doesn't have the opportunity to learn all that stuff. Information, similarities, arithmetic, vocabulary, and so on. And today in the WISC-5, the same subtests are still there many years later. So this prompted me to really think about how we should measure intelligence and how to be able to equitably measure intelligence. And I published my first paper on equity in 1982. And my first test that I published in 1985 was designed to provide an equitable way of measuring general ability for students, especially intellectually gifted students from disadvantaged backgrounds. One of the advantages of being a test author is you have a lot of data from standardization. And so what I did right from the very beginning was ask the critical questions. Do you get race differences on this nonverbal test? Answer, no. Do you get male-female differences? No. Do you get strong correlation with achievement? Yes. So this is the test, matrix analogies test, that became the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test and all the different editions over the many decades. Every time I got another edition, I asked the same questions over and over again and got the same answers every time. Similar scores by race, similar scores by ethnicity and sex, and yet strong correlations with achievement. So this line of research, published in all the major journals, convinced me that measuring intelligence using test questions that evaluated how well a student can think was a valid and equitable way to measure general intelligence. I'm going to explain this a little bit more. The typical matrices item, like on the NNAT or like on the new test that Kim will talk about in a few minutes. What do you do when you look at this question? Well, you have to examine this relationship and this one to figure out which one of these goes on the question mark. You don't have to label them, describe them in any words. Or you could describe them in any words in any language. Doesn't really matter. Of course, 2 is the answer, in case you're wondering. I'm sure you all got that. But look at this question. Girl is to woman as boy is to man. Same structure. Question is an analogy. An analogy horizontally and vertically. Here's another example. 3 is to 9 as 4 is to 16. This demands more knowledge of squaring a number. And now the next one I show you, I will bet no one in the audience can answer. C7 is to F as E7 is to. Now you might be thinking C, D, E, F, that's 3 steps. So E, F, G, H would be the answer, but it's not. The answer is A, because it's musical and we don't have an H. No, we have A through G. Anyway, so if I measured your intelligence by how well you could answer these musical questions, that would be just as wrong as what I did with the young lady in Supai village, asking her to define and use English. Now, I had a wonderful opportunity to see another case, a different kind of a case, some years ago, and I want to just share this story of Devion. I was in my office at George Mason and got a call from Daniel Golden from the Wall Street Journal, who was writing an article about Devion, and he asked me if he could ask me some questions. I said, of course. His first question was really good. He said, is it possible that a student could get 141 standard score on your test and not be smart? I thought, wow, awesome question. Easy to answer. No. You can't guess 241. He started telling me, and then I realized it was Devion Ross, who I actually knew of already, never met him, but knew of him through Susan Rhodes, the director of Gifted in that district where he lived in Springfield, Illinois. Just to give you some context, family is in poverty. Devion reads a lot at home, does a lot of things at home, has an old computer with a mouse that doesn't work. He likes to write and read, but he doesn't like to tell anybody about it. In school, he's not doing well. He's the only African-American student to qualify, but he's not getting good grades. Teacher says he's not cooperative. He refused to write a letter to Mickey Mouse. I'm sure he thought that's kind of silly with somebody being that smart, right? But he said, I would have written a whole book on Pokemon, but of course teacher wouldn't, that wasn't the, wasn't what the teacher wanted. Teacher did not think he should be in the gifted program. But because of that high score and because of the efforts of Susan Rhodes, he got in. And some years later, graduated. Here he is at graduation. He joined the Marines, got an advanced degree, and his father was recently interviewed on the local news. I won't play the news video clip for you, but I'll just summarize by saying Mr. Ross was very clear that when Devion got into the gifted program, his mind was challenged, and that made all the difference. And when Devion was tested, neither Mr. Ross or Mrs. Ross had their high school diplomas, and Mr. Ross goes on to say that when they saw that Devion could get his high school diploma, they decided to get theirs as well, and they did. So the 141 impacted Devion and the whole family. That's the power of what we call a nonverbal test of general ability. It's fair and equitable for everyone. So I realized that we should measure intelligence in a way that is not dependent on knowledge. That was the foundation of so much of my work in the area of intelligence. But I think it's important to take a pause here, kind of a step towards understanding a little bit more of the history. Why do we measure intelligence using knowledge? So I really love to read the history of intelligence tests. I have a whole stack of old books, brown pages, aged over time, 100-year-old books. And when I go through and read these, I found out something really important. So Binet basically had 3 versions of his tests, the 05, 08, and the 11. And Binet explicitly wrote that when he developed the 1911 scale, he took out the questions on the previous edition, excuse me, that demanded too much school learning. When Terman built the Stanford Binet, he put all that verbal stuff, information, similarities, or arithmetic word problems and so on. He put all that stuff back into his version of the Binet, which became the Stanford Binet. Now, Terman had a student, Arthur Otis, of the Otis Lenin. Otis was also instrumental in the development of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, the two tests used developed by the US Army for World War I evaluation of recruits. And why that's important is because there was a 20-something-year-old Army person, Army man, who was giving the Army Alpha and the Army Beta and decided those tests could be used by clinical psychologists. That was David Wexler. So the reason that you have the verbal stuff in the Wexler is because of Otis and Terman. But I would argue Binet had it right. Binet was right when he said those tests should not have been there. But as you can see in this image of the Army mental test, David Wexler's signature at the top there, you can see the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. That was the foundation of the WISC. And now the WISC has a lot more scales. That's because Pearson's trying to make it appeal to more people, but it's still basically the same thing that we've had since 1939. And that goes all the way back to 27 with the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And all the tests, like the WISC and the WJ and the COGAT and the Otis Lenin and others like that, they all have this content because of this original impact. Now, here's a very important piece to this puzzle. When I say the content of the tests or demanded too much knowledge, how does that fit in with current thinkings about fairness? Well, some people say that if a test is not biased, you can use it. I say, if a test is not biased, that's only half the story. The other half of test fairness is about test equity, which is about the questions on the test. So the standards for educational and psychological testing make a clear distinction between test bias and equity and state if a person has had limited opportunities to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair, even if there's no evidence of psychometric test bias. So when someone says to you, you can use a test like the WISC or the COGAT or whatever because they don't have test bias, that's not the whole story. You have to ask the question, what does the student need to know to answer the questions? And if they have to know things, that's the equity piece. Now, if you think about the most often used tests in our field of gifted, what do you see? The top two are the COGAT and the WISC. My nonverbal test is the third most widely used. And then the Woodcock Johnson, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, Otis Lenin. Really, of all of those 6 tests, mine is the only one that measures intelligence in a way that's not confounded, that's not distorted, it's not influenced by knowledge. What's the impact? Well, in the book that Kim and Dina and I just published a few months ago, we've tried to quantify how many people out there are we missing in gifted. And the way that these numbers were calculated is simply getting the number of students in public education, K to 12, using simple math to get the number potentially gifted, 8%, in other words, 92nd percentile. That's actually conservative. Some people say 90th and above, some people say 95th. We chose 8, it seemed reasonable. And then we compared the number potentially to the number who actually are gifted, and the difference, and we get 873,000. Brilliant, wonderfully smart, Black and brown children who are smart enough to be gifted but aren't. And a big piece of that is the test that he used. And of course, not every school district identifies gifted kids. And if we add another 40% approximately for those districts that aren't finding kids at all, the number comes up to 1.25 million really smart, wonderful people in K-12 right now who are smart enough to gifted but aren't. And a big piece of that revolves around the test that we use and the way we use the data. Because you can have a really equitable test, but if you don't use it correctly, it's not going to work in the long term. Now, we also have the problem at the other end of the distribution, at the bottom side, where we over-identify individual Black students with intellectual disability. So this problem of too few gifted, too many students at the other end who are Black, this is a real serious problem that we need to fix, and then COVID comes along. So let's think about COVID for a second. What happened? Kids didn't learn. So if kids don't learn very well, and we know which kids learned less than others, right? Kids from poverty, the kids with disadvantage, the kids who had computers and tutors and everything else at home, and they didn't have as great an impact, but certainly some impact. So now think about this. If you give a test of intelligence that demands knowledge, and it's based on norms from pre-COVID times, that means the scores on those tests are suspect. We don't know how much effect there is there. Is it a little or is it a lot? I think that we should be using tests that were normed post-COVID or tests that don't demand knowledge. Now, that brings us to the test that Kim and Dina and I created to measure general ability equitably using verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative test content. I said that very carefully. I'm going to say it again. We created 3 tests in the traditional model to measure general ability using verbal content, nonverbal content, and quantitative content. And we did this very explicitly. I'll just say a few things, and I'm going to turn it over to Kim to finish the presentation for today. But we explicitly made these tests for equitable identification of students from culturally diverse backgrounds. And when I originally spoke with Kim and Dina about this idea, I had a particular publisher in mind. And I had the opportunity to move from the publisher that I worked with the NNet to a new publisher that I started working with about 15 years ago, called MHS, stands for Multi-Health Systems. MHS is the company that publishes the Naglieri General Ability Tests. I brought the 3 of us there because of the people that run that organization. Their vision is about the kids, and that's their focus, and that's what we really cared about. So here's what we did. We created a verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative tests, and Kim is going to describe more of it for now. I'm going to stop so she can finish up the rest of the presentation. Just want to say again, you can be in touch with me. Go to our website, naglierigifted.com, for more information, and feel free to be in touch with me.